So the rising outrage that we're seeing across France right now is in response to the death of a teenager on Tuesday. Now, Nahal M, the 17-year-old, was driving a car in Paris when he was shot dead fatally by a police officer. Now, we've heard from the French prosecutor that according to two police officers that were at the scene, they attempted to pull over the driver because he had Polish number plates. They say that he was driving erratically. They then say that when the driver, Nahal, failed to stop, one of the officers shot the driver. Now, videos that we have seen of the incident appears to show the driver driving away from the officers when that shot was fired. Now, the 17-year-old died on the scene. He was wounded fatally. He was shot in the chest. And since his death became made public, and since the video of the shooting was made public as well, there's been unrest across France. We've seen 2 nights of protests. They've become increasingly violent. On the second night of protests, 150 people were arrested. We saw that they lit cars on fire. They set fire to public buildings. They also launched fireworks at police officers. Now, police officers in return fired tear gas in an attempt to disperse the crowd. Now, the police in France have deployed another 40,000 riot officers across the country in anticipation of a third night of protests. There's currently in France right now, in Paris, there's a march taking place. Now, this is a march that's meant to be in memory of the 17-year-old Nahal. This march was called for by his mother. So we're seeing more people taking to the streets of France on what is now the 3rd day since the 17-year-old was shot dead at the police stop by this police officer.
Yeah. Michelle, the President Emmanuel Macron held crisis talks with his cabinet. What has he said so far?
So the President has asked for this specific march that's taking place in Paris right now to be a march of contemplation and respect. He's called for public calm, and he's called the violence and destruction that we've seen on the streets of France over the last 2 nights unjustifiable. On the other hand, he's also condemned the actions by the police officer. He's called his use of force inexcusable, and he's called these crisis talks and meetings with his emergency ministerial team. They're looking to respond to this rising anger and to call for investigations into the police powers that saw this event take place.
It's quite interesting to note, Michelle, that this type of event has actually happened quite frequently.
Yeah, so France is seeing a rising number of fatalities at police stops. In fact, just last year, there was a record number of 13 people killed at police stops. Now, this is seen to be the result of a change to police powers in 2005, where officers were given greater powers to use their guns in more circumstances, including when they believe that lives are to be at risk. Now, the police officers in this incident say that they felt that their lives and that lives of pedestrians were at risk as Nahal drove away. Now, we're also hearing from media. So the Reuters news agency has released its own findings that since 2017, the number of fatalities in France, the number of people that were shot dead at routine police stops, were in the majority black and Arab members of the French population. Now, Nahal, the 17-year-old who was shot in this case, he is of French-Algerian background. So there's also been talks of perhaps an inequality in the incidents of shootings. So not only are we seeing a rise in shootings and fatalities at these police stops, we're also seeing an inequality in those victims of these shootings. So that's also part of what is fueling this outrage on the streets of France right now.
Yeah, that there may be this sort of racial component. What's happened to the police officer involved?
So the police officer hasn't been formally identified publicly. We don't know a lot about him. What we do know is that he handed himself into police, into his own officers after this incident occurred. He reported himself. The French prosecutor has since said that his use of his firearm was unlawful and that he's being investigated for involuntary homicide. The French prosecutor has recommended that the officer be reprimanded and to be held while the investigation takes place by 2 magistrates. So we're waiting to see what happens with that police officer and for more details about him to emerge.
Yes, and potentially another very violent night coming up. Good to have you on. Thanks, Michelle.